That's an interesting question. Is CJCC executive a public meeting?
Yes, it is.
All the work groups are.
All right.
You're now live.
Thank you.
All right, looks like we've got Andrea coming online here, and it looks like we would have a quorum, Chris. So I think it's up to you if you want to wait a couple more minutes or if we want to get started.
It's right at 12, so we'll just wait a couple of, maybe till 2 after or something.
I was at a training recently, and they really recommended bumping meeting start times like 10 minutes after the hour, just to give people a chance to go to the bathroom or scarf their lunch down. Or I think that's Judge coming on.
11111.
He's number one.
Multiple times over.
Judge Schmelzer, is that you with the 1111?
It's a mystery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's Andrea phoning in, but I think it was Judge from another call that we had, that he was his signature.
He just unmuted himself. Who is calling from the 1111?
This is Judge Smeltzer.
Okay, thank you.
I can't get rid of those darn ones. I'll figure it out. At least I'm starting at the beginning.
You're number one.
Well, thank you.
Well, it looks like Andrea was taking a call. I suppose we can go ahead and get started and do some of the front end stuff here. So we'd call the meeting to order. I think it's obvious who we've got on the line. So I would look for a motion to approve the minutes from December 9th.
Move.
Second?
I'll second that.
Okay. Any discussion? Otherwise, all those in favor of approving the minutes from December 9th signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Second, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Staff report, Sarah.
All right, thanks, Chris. Some updates for the group. We know that the governor released his budget. That's just kind of a wish list of the ask from the executive, but they did increase TAD dollars overall. So we'll have to see as it goes through the legislature really what comes out at the other side. But there is, from what we hear on the state front, just good bipartisan support for the treatment, alternative, and diversion funding that the state provides to the counties. So they're looking at reducing the county match to 10% and then about doubling the ask as far as TAD dollars. So
What is the current, what's the match now, Sarah?
25% match. So looking, and they were trying to remove that match altogether, but at least getting it down to 10% is helpful. Also on the state front, there are a number of criminal justice issues that are being recommended by the governor, and the legislature's taking up some of these issues as well. For example, expungement, they're kind of reviewing the rules around expungement, who's allowed to get things expunged and in what time frame. So again, we'll just kind of keep our eye on those activities and report back any changes that occur. Right now, it's just they're meeting in committees and discussing things.
It makes it more restrictive, correct?
It actually opens it up quite a bit.
Oh, does it? Oh, I
yeah.
thought it was the other direction. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think it would be allow more people to partake in that expungement option than currently. And then on the grant front, just want to thank Chris for taking the lead on that CBDG housing grant, and it got shipped off to the powers that be today. Appreciate just everyone, all the committees and everyone's help in all of the requirements really necessary for us to submit that grant. So there was a number of resolutions that had to come through various groups. So we worked together and got that submitted. So that will be a huge reprieve in the housing issues that we've got going on in Dunn County. So we just in sore need of that money for housing. So thanks, Chris, for doing that. And then as far as some of the other grants, our TAD grant, we finally received the fourth quarter reimbursement that was fully expended. We just got our fourth quarter reentry reimbursement. So we left about $6,000 on the table there. We had a unfunded position for the good part of 2020.
Unfilled position.
Unfilled.
Funded, but unfilled.
Funded, but unfilled. And then we did receive our the DOJ coronavirus grant, the reimbursement for the courtroom upgrade for the fourth quarter of 2020. So we've got another claim to make here in the spring, but those are moving ahead. So that is my update, unless there's questions. And I'm just going to note that we've got Judge Peterson joining us as well.
All right, number 6, input from the CJCC for the 2020 County Board Report, which would go out for the March meeting.
Yeah, so annually we report to the county board on our activities with the CJCC. That template has been kind of devised by our communications work group, and we've been using that kind of template for the last couple of years. So my intention is to update that with 2020 activities. Also wanted to include our smash board for 2020. So we've got our data work groups meeting tomorrow. So we're hoping to be able to finalize the smash board numbers to include in our annual report. And then we wanted to include the recidivism study that we presented to the council back in November at our last meeting to be part of that packet that goes out. So the county board is just looking for a written report this year, not a narrative companion or anything. So those were the ideas that I was thinking, but I wanted to get the input of this group because it really is a responsibility of this group as far as what we include in those reports. So any additions or areas of emphasis that we want to ensure is included in that report.
The only thing that I would say, Sarah, is I think you, oh, sorry, Andrea. Go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering what information from the data work group you'd be sharing. I mean, I think I would think that the county board might be interested in, the number of cases that we're having. And I think it's interesting, the blood alcohol and the number of offenses.
Oh, from the alcohol data that we researched? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. We've got that ready and available.
Yeah, since it's written on electronic. The other thing that I thought about was, I think you have a nice table that shows the various grants and then where we're at in the life of those.
Yes.
Anything else that people think should be included in that report? Looks like you've got the feedback, Sarah.
Great.
I'm just wondering if, so I was just going to say, Chris, on that, as far as in the report, I don't know if you want to put anything in, about, dealing with this COVID this last year, how we all had to function differently, and that we've limped through. It hasn't been pretty, but we're still working at it. And then if we can see if we have any glimpse of how we're going to move out of this, we'll probably take some of this with us, but hopefully there's a light at the end of the tunnel here.
On that, I guess, would we want Chris to kind of do something, being that she's chair this year, or Judge Peterson?
No, I think
that he
Chris,
was
that's an excellent idea, Chris, Sarah, that Chris could come up with something.
I can come up with something.
Okay.
Brief. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me just make a note, or I'll go right out my.
I'm done,
brain.
Chris.
Okay. All right, moving on. So number 6 is the discussion on work group utility and priorities. So Sarah and I were having a conversation when we were preparing for this agenda, or preparing this agenda, and it actually kind of it accompanies the consideration of actions, which is the update on the goals and work group activities. But at one point in our conversation, we talked about, from this group's perspective, how do we gauge whether our existing work groups are still relevant and the ones that we should have in place in order to continue to move our group forward? Or, because I know that the propensity is to create something and then it just goes on and on into infinity, whether it's still relevant or not. And so I don't have any pre-conclusion about whether or not that's true or not for us, but I just thought it's a good time for us to talk about, is there something we're missing? Is there something we should be focused on? Or are our existing work groups and activities still the most relevant?
I would just add as an introduction that currently we've got 9 different work groups, advisory groups that we are running. And to Chris's point, we do have the tendency to create things and then never take them away. I think only work group that we have that was started and then reached conclusion was our deferred prosecution work group that Andrea had led up several years ago. The other work groups have been perpetually meeting. Some work groups have real purposes and discussion. Others seem a little bit more routine at this point now that we've got the processes and things set up. So example, communication work group, when we've got topics that we're working on, it makes sense to have meetings and work on that. We created that as a work group because it was something we thought was missing, just that really pointed, clear communication across the board. But I think that's one that is up for perhaps discussion on the utility of it, because we've really incorporated that into all of the aspects of what we're trying to do across the board. Another is data work group. That's more routine. We've got the data flowing. They're proofing it, checking it. That seems to be going well. They've got very defined projects that they're working on, so that makes sense. Our EBDM work group, we've got Jim Tripp taking over with that group. He's looking at different goals than we've had in the past, looking at housing, looking at continuing some efforts with youth, and looking at, oh gosh, the third one is escaping me right now. But just a different kind of focus that we're doing right in the EBDM. Stepping Up, that's been a work group that's been meeting monthly under Chris's leadership. We have kind of backed off to let the two sub-work groups really focus on the housing and enhancing crisis options. So that's both an initiative and a work group. We've got the alcohol initiative. That's just more of an initiative overall. We've got this executive group. We have the drug endangered children work group, which we've recently mapped and identified some areas to work on, and we're going to be meeting later on this afternoon. So that, I think that group has some defined goals. And then we've got our treatment court advisory, and then we've got our family treatment court oversight and planning committee, which we also have an action item on for.
So my understanding, we, or at least, is that up for today? We're combining the family treatment court and the adult treatment court into one committee or one work group?
Yes.
Yep, we got an action for that, and I got a proposed mission statement.
Okay,
But you know,
And the
that's
other
still
thing-
part of the discussion here on the relevancy of those groups and the utility of them as well.
Of course, your CC executive committee, that's not a work group.
And if you think about the big picture of criminal justice collaboration or criminal justice system programming in Dunn County, do those work groups still capture what we believe will be necessary to continue to create efficiencies and effectiveness, some of the pieces of our mission?
I wonder if it makes sense. Sarah, you're in the best position to know what the groups are, the content of their discussions, the quality of their products. Does it make sense for you to make a recommendation on which ones should continue, which ones might be combined into one, and which ones should be discontinued?
Sure. And, you know, I think they've all been valuable and helpful in helping us progress what we're doing. But I do think the communications work group as a standalone work group, I guess, I don't know that would be necessary. I think we've got the relationships and the ability to pull that together if we have areas that we want to put a forum together or do certain things. I think there's some redundancies with other groups out in the community as well when we're looking at some of the efforts. Public health has a number of different work groups as well. We've got the housing group. We've got the alcohol, nicotine, and drug group. They're also doing some communication efforts. So I think at times I think we want to perpetuate what we're doing and create more work, but then that also takes away from what we already have going. So for example, we've got these work groups and we want them to keep doing these things or do more and more and more just to keep doing them and stay viable. But really, is it important and is it connected to what this overall group wants to do? As far as the leadership of the council. So I think some of the work groups have grown legs and are kind of moving around and are looking for ways to stay relevant and active when it's not as relative to what we're doing. And then a lot of the work falls on me to do. So even though we have committees, we've got groups, ultimately it's me doing the work and bringing it back. And that gets more diffused as well. When we've got more projects, we've got more areas that we want to keep everything going and do more and more without taking anything away. So I guess long answer to your question, I guess I probably would recommend that the communication work group really doesn't need to be functioning as a work group. We can certainly convene and get the expertise of that work group, but that's the smallest work group. And it is a lot of the same faces that we see in our other work groups. We've got Chris and Andrea and a good portion of the work groups overall. Katie as well. She's not here today, but she's in a lot of the work groups as well. Where we're, I just don't know if that one is as standalone important as some of the other ones. I would also say, the Stepping Up work group, I think that's an initiative that we want to be really carrying forth across all of our work groups. But having that as a standalone work group, I'm not sure that's as helpful, I guess, to us overall, because we have divulged into these smaller groups so they can really dig into these problem areas and work on them. Data work group is certainly, I think has allowed us to bring home the bacon, meaning it gives us, we've got these relationships, we've got the data, we're able to proof the data. I think that's been really helpful in getting us additional funding when we've been looking for it. We've got a lot of processes that allow us to capture the data. So I think that is definitely an ongoing effort of this group, and whether they meet monthly or quarterly, I think that can be of the prerogative of that work group.
Sarah, if I could, just a question on the data. Once you set up a data work group, and that was set up to look at what data we could create and what data we could mine for purposes of supporting what we do. Mm-hmm. Now, have we evolved long enough where we now know how to mine the data? And so that's an ongoing process where we still get the data, and that could end up being at your direction or wherever it is, the folks that are, coming up with that information. You still have the ability as the Cjcc coordinator to request that, or the executive committee request it. So what I'm saying is, has that work group accomplished its purpose? Generally, what I'm hearing is that we establish work groups, and generally you do a work group as something that's finite, that it's got an objective, it's achieved, then it's disbanded. And I think you run into it gets a little bit mushy. We get a little bit rudderless if we have work groups that just continue on and on and on. And so I think you have to look at the necessity of having some of these activities labeled a work group. If we're already doing it, well, we should learn from work groups. If it's something that's important, we standardize it and make it part of our functioning. And so that's the only thing I would suggest.
Yeah, and absolutely to your point, for example, data work group, the purpose is to provide guidance in the collection and integration of criminal justice data consistent with the priorities of the executive committee. So, in response to your question, I think they have set that up and we have those processes in place, and we are informing the work groups in the council. So maybe data as its own work group isn't necessarily not needed. It's more of the process that's integrated.
And there's one thing that the reason I say this, Chris, as far as chairing, like the Cjcc and directing it, what we want a Cjcc to be as it evolves, you want it to be nimble, where it doesn't become so part of a bureaucratic process, but rather it reacts to those needs that are arising, that either the executive committee, along with our council, we identify needs, then we create that work group to get it done. But you don't want to keep carrying all these work groups, because then it becomes baggage. And You got to be careful on that. That's my last words. I'm talking too much and you're on your own anyway. I mean, so.
Are there others? So I'm hearing communications stepping up and data work groups. Are there any others that we feel have done their job? I mean, this in no way reflects on the value of what they've done. The question is whether or not there's value in the meeting going forward. Are there others that we feel have done their job that we don't need to continue?
Well, I think an area of ambiguity is the evidence-based decision-making work group. So we call that a work group, but that more is our kind of policy committee almost, as far as where we're looking at different programs and policies to try to kind of get them through the system. So maybe the work group on that is a little bit of a misnomer. I think that group is still important and relevant to get the leaders, because this group is different than that group, right? We've got a lot of the same folks in that group, but we're really talking about some of the nuts and bolts of the criminal justice process and evidence-based processes. So perhaps that's more of a committee and not a work group. But I think that's important for us to have a opportunity to talk about some of these, but we are going in a radically different direction with each chair that is coming into the EBDM.
Well, it's almost like, okay, this is all coming together just as I talk. So if it falls apart halfway through, you'll know why. It's almost like, yeah, like we need, so there's this executive committee, which I think has had fairly clear function, but I think there's almost like this, it's almost like you could roll a bunch of things collectively into that concept of EBDM, emerging trends, finger on the pulse of, kind of, and then that could be a spot to vet. So like, for instance, I think about Jim Tripp's stated interest in looking at housing. Well, it doesn't make no sense for EBDM and stepping up to be working on both of those both of that in addition to the health done right. So like sort of just figuring out how well that fits together, and maybe that's where that goes. The crisis enhancement piece that's coming out of stepping up could easily fit in EBDM, because it's really about looking at evidence-based means of addressing crisis services in our community. So it seems like that might be an okay spot to have a committee structure that's really looking at kind of more in the weeds of the priorities of the CJCC. I don't know.
Well, I think this executive committee actually gives direction, and we should be making sure when you look at EDM, the evidence-based decision-making, are we as an executive committee have we given them sufficient guidance? What's the parameters of what they should be looking at, rather than, like you say, all of a sudden we got evidence-based decision-making looking at a housing issue that some other group is looking at. You don't want redundancy. So that's just, I think, from managing your work groups to make sure they have clear defined roles. And we're going to always have new folks coming into this process, and they have to get an understanding how the process works and what their different responsibilities are. So I think, and part of this, when I'm listening to this, is this is a topic that we want to take a step back and look at and just see how this all fits with the understanding of what do work groups do with the understanding that we generally, I think we could probably agree on, they're created for a specific purpose. And then once that's accomplished, how do we define what we do with them? And but by the same token, I think your work groups have to get some guidance from this committee and the chair to make sure they're consistent with the overall objectives of our CJCC. So that I would watch that, and it's going to take some work to probably work our way through this, but I think it's a good idea to be thinking about this to give us a little bit, I guess, more credence to what we're doing and more focus. And rather than, because hey, one thing looking at this group, we all know we're a small county and we get so many of us over the years. We've been on, 1 or 2 or 5 committees. We end up being chair of 5 committees. Well, you can't keep that up, being a chair of 5 different committees. Plus doing our day job. It doesn't work that way. So we got to learn to be a little bit more nimble and, and get things done and then move on to other things, keeping our overall focus. So this is a good discussion. Good discussion.
No, I appreciate all of your feedback. It was exactly the conversation that I hoped that we would be able to have to start anyway. And maybe Sarah and I can work together over the next month to come back in our next meeting, April meeting, and just with some recommendations for some changes or maybe not. But given the conversation, it sounds like there could be some sort of strategic moving around of where our energies are being expended.
The last thing I'll offer is that it occurs to me that maybe what we want to do going forward is the things that we might need a group to do, a committee to do, maybe more discreet than broad. When we started out with CJCC, there were broad issues that required a lot of thought. Now, I think the issues that come up, they're going to be more discreet, more refined. So maybe in the future, what this committee, as executive committee, does is look to assign ad hoc committees with a clearly defined purpose that has when that purpose is achieved, that product is produced, ceases, and they're set up, understood to be that way. But what I hear you saying, Chris, is you're not looking for a motion today that any of these be discontinued. You and Sarah will look at it again, maybe come forward next time with specific recommendations along those lines.
Wanted to see if it was a area of interest of exploration, or if everyone was comfortable with what we were doing, well then, so be it. But it sounds like there's some interest in at least taking a little deeper look at it.
Yep.
That would also give me the opportunity to talk with the work group members and get their input on
Absolutely. Chairs. Yep.
All
right.
Real quickly, sorry, I know we want to get on, but
Go ahead. You're good.
I would agree wholeheartedly about communication work group. We made our logo. We had some initiatives. I think we're done with that. As far as data too, I think we have those processes in place. I also think, and I don't know enough, I think that housing is certainly an issue that we need to be addressing. But when I think of EBDM for the criminal justice, in the criminal justice world, I don't know if I would have chosen housing as a priority for the EBDM. So maybe we want to look at EBDM again. As far as next month's, I'm ready for action items to eliminate the communication work group and even data. So that's.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that input. And EBDM is going to be meeting tomorrow and continuing that goals discussion. So there isn't any decision on that to really bring back to this group at this point.
All right. So you have written for item number 7, work group reports and recommendations. You have written a written summary from Sarah. So I don't believe, unless there are any questions regarding the work activities of the work group, that we need to go into that in any more depth. Any questions about those work group activities as they currently exist? All right, then we are on to consideration for actions to be taken by the committee for recommendation to the council. And the first of those is looking at a mission statement for combining family treatment court and adult treatment court advisory groups.
All right, and I do have some background material to share. This one as well, as I'm thinking about it and as we're having the conversation about the utility of the work groups, I struggled on the utility of these groups as well, and really defining the level of governance that is really necessary for these different work groups. So I'm going to share my screen. I've got a document to help us just kind of walk through. Let's see.
While you're doing that, Sarah, can I just say, I think that something that we get stuck in Dunn County, or a spot that we get stuck in, is the fact that, in a lot of, certainly in counties that are just a smidge bigger than us, they don't have all of the key decision makers at the table all the time.
Mhm.
And so some of these, like the Family Treatment Court and the Adult Treatment Court Advisory Group, the idea is you don't have your sheriff, your judges, your county management, your DH. You don't have all of those people at the table on a regular basis. They have their people that do those things. And this is the one opportunity that you bring those people to the table. We are just small enough that most of the time we have key leadership at the table for these things.
And some of us don't have any people to send anyway.
Exactly. So I think that, I think that's a good thought about whether there is utility for it or not, in light of our discussion a few minutes ago.
Right, because part of the oversight of this group and the council itself is of the different programs that we provide. So, and with both Family Treatment Court and Treatment Court, there are teams, that work with clients. Then there's the broader kind of operational team that includes managers and stakeholders. And then there should be some sort of oversight, which is elected officials and folks that would be part of this group, as far as would be providing some oversight. But that group, when we say oversight, it really doesn't have the knowledge and ability to provide the day-to-day oversight. It's more of how can we reduce barriers and look at funding and prioritize. So there's very different discrete activities of each of the different levels of work group. And I think this is one that we have struggled with, really the value of it, because it's not the day-to-day stuff. We are reporting back to the greater council, and we're looking at outcomes of the courts. We have these programs up and running, so they do need that day-to-day tending to. But Chris, for example, our Family Treatment Court, we're still having a lot of meetings outside of all these other structured meetings to really get that program to full blossom and potential sustainability. So a lot of our governance structures aren't really working for us, as far as they're not working for us as a mechanism to move these things. It feels like more of something that we have to just, okay, we have this advisory box checked, but it's not the intent of it. It's not really providing that oversight.
Sarah, I'll just mention here, and for Chris and Judge Peterson, when you look at these treatment court oversights, I think that was kind of a requirement, partly of the funding we were receiving from the state for these groups, that we had to have an oversight group. Now, the only question I have, and I just posed this, and I think we've discussed this before, is there any reason why the Cjcc Executive Committee could not be the oversight group that for treatment courts? It's an ongoing, set, functioning activity and process that we have within the county, and that as far as once a year or whatever, how often you have a report from your treatment court coordinators. You have them come before us, make a report of how it's going, to justify, what they've done. They could also probably make recommendations to the executive committee what needs they are. And they could also, and of course, under your guidance, also keeping abreast of what additional funding may be sought to enhance these. But it seems to me that us as an executive committee in the Cjcc could handle that function. It eliminates trying to keep track of additional these groups that we have to meet just to, like you say, Sarah, check a box. we got to quit checking the boxes and start having more time to do legitimate stuff.
Well, Sarah used the word earlier, initiative. And I see family treatment court and adult treatment court as initiatives. I mean, they're programs, but I think that I like that idea that we could set aside time. We could determine an annual schedule and we could set aside time to just come back, bring back to the executive committee representatives of efforts that are occurring within our community or our county regarding some of these initiatives, and call that, instead of moving them to have to meet on a regular basis, to just reiterate work that's happening in other ways. So like communication, I mean, like that would be, we could have a focus of an executive committee meeting that just talks about what communication efforts are occurring and whether there's anything that's being missed or should be enhanced. But that can happen. We could do that pretty easily. And so maybe in light of that, maybe we put on hold A and B and review that under 8A and B, and review that, review the concept of that in light of all of the rest of the groups that we're looking at, and make a recommendation regarding that next month, if that would be agreeable to the group.
Sarah, do you know off the top of your head if it is required for the grants to have this oversight? I feel like I remember.
For the grants, they consider the Cjcc to be the oversight, or just our full council. Yep, just as long as we're, taking up the topic and paying attention to it, that is sufficient. And the research shows that having an advisory group with the community, there's just no real research on that as far, because that was also part of the intent of the advisory, is that's our way to communicate with businesses and other providers. But that just really hasn't ever panned out in the reality of the workings of that group. So I guess I would agree with Chris that I think we would be premature in the action of this group in light of our discussion with the relevance of the other groups. So I would also agree that perhaps Chris and I can really take a deeper look at the structure and bring back some recommendations at our next meeting, which will be at the end of March, so not too far away.
Agreeable to everyone? Okay. We're
Yes.
not acting very governmental. We're talking about eliminating work groups and committees. We're not I don't know. I'm
Well,
sad about
I'll
all
ask
this.
Mr.
I want
Miller,
more
I
meetings.
do we want to, there was one time, we used to make motions to table. I'm not even so sure that's a relevant motion anymore. So I guess that's why I didn't raise it, Paul, because I knew you'd jump all over me. So I'm going to leave it alone.
So we can just let them ride, not take action on them, not move forward, or not do anything with them?
There's nothing on the agenda that obligates you to take any actions whatsoever. You can have it as an action item, but you don't have to take action.
All right.
You just can't act on something that you didn't agenda.
Exactly. All right.
What's on the next agenda then?
So that would then lead us to number 8, letter C, updates on goals and work group 2021 goals and work group activities.
So this also blends in with the conversation. So we do have our deck work group, as I mentioned, is going to be meeting later on this afternoon and is looking at the goals for this year. We had a chair change, so we do have kind of a different priority, different focus. So that's kind of the sequence is a little bit out of whack there. So we still have a discussion and come to consensus on far as what we're going to work on with goals for that group. But again, I guess, and Andrea, feel free to jump in. I think with our deck group, it is more of a defined focus area that we're kind of honing in on. So there's, we've got about 7 different priority areas potentially to take on this year. So that's to come yet. Our EBDM meeting, as I mentioned, is also going to be meeting tomorrow. We did have a goals discussion in our January meeting to try to get a sense of what was important for the members of that group. We're going to be bringing it back tomorrow and hoping to kind of reach consensus on what the group wants to work on. But that's what we're looking at. Housing, OWI efforts was the one I couldn't remember before, and then youth. So those are some areas that kind of new territory potentially for that group. And then data work group had recommended that an additional goal was to increase program referrals across the board with pre-charge, diversion, our top program, treatment court, family treatment court. Really looking at the data made that recommendation. But kind of thinking about it, that's a good goal for us to have, but I don't know if it's a goal of the data work group to increase the referrals. They're just really making that, that recommendation to the others. So that's kind of where we are, I guess, at the goals discussion or just the update at this point.
So maybe with regard to that as an action item, it really rolls into the rest of it. I mean, it doesn't pay to move forward and approve goals and activities for work groups that next month we might dissolve. So maybe that all becomes part of the same conversation for next month.
Yeah, and I feel like this is a little bit messy, but at the same time about the government, kind of the comment about government, right? We're good at creating more and more and more, but it really does, this is the time we've got a new chair to really look at the focus of the work groups, how we're spending our time. Are we prioritizing those things that are most important to the group? Because we can't keep doing it all without getting more people and kind of creating more and more government. And that, I don't think that's the direction that we're wanting to go. So it's really just being more effective and more efficient with the time and the people that we have, and that we're actually going after funding for the things that are our priority areas. So we're moving them ahead.
All right. To be continued. So our next meeting date, the executive committee meets a month from now on March 24th. And then the next CJCC group at large meeting will be on April 8th. Anything else that we have to tackle today?
One more thing that I left off of the staff report, just want to let folks know that as far as the county board, they're taking a look at the directional plan, and we had the criminal justice policy on there. So I'm going to be working with Jim Tripp and some others, County Manager Paul, and our planner, just to look at our criminal justice policy and see how it kind of, because we essentially are that policy. So we're really looking to update that, shore it up. And again, I think that is also consistent with the conversation that we're having here as far as priorities, goals, and objectives.
Sarah, there was one point, and I think Chris mentioned it, and Paul, you addressed it as well. This one's for probably Chair Bartlett. I think the original strategic plan and for the county, when we identified criminal justice as part of that long-term strategic plan, part of that was to come up with effective strategies within the resources of the county. And I think that's just an over-guiding thing that we sometimes forget when I heard people talking about we create and we expand a government, but there's that overriding concern that we do things within the confines of the money we have available. And we even used to talk about, look at what we do, and do we need to look at moving resources that we use in one area because it's probably no longer productive, and we move it to another area. That's a conversation we sometimes don't have often. I'm done.
Well, I think it's exciting to think about. I mean, every time that we have an opportunity to write a grant, or we're looking at historically, and I think about where we've come over the last, say, 10 years or a little bit more, I think it's really exciting. And I think it's just so interesting to see the evolution of what we've grown from to where we are now. And really, using your word, Judge Smelter, how nimble we've been able to be to really maximize on some opportunities. But I know that we are always struggling against this sort of the status quo of wanting to fall back into just doing what we do because we've always done it. And so, so I appreciate the conversation and the input, and we will try to make sure that what we continue to do is relevant to continuing to create an effective and efficient system.
Chris, if I can just throw out one more thing that keeps going in the back of my head is, and I think there's some overlap happening with the police department and their Project Hope. Sarah had the chief, speak at our last DEC meeting, and I think there's some duplication of goals moving forward with trying to provide mentoring for children, and then I hear about Ebdm and trying to work on youth, and I know that they're moving forward with their plan. I just want to throw it out there that when we consider our goals, if we can try to, if they align with what the PD is doing, we try to piggyback off of what they're doing, so we're not duplicating efforts and we're trying to work together on similar goals.
Excellent point. Right. Anybody else? Otherwise, we're adjourned.